Do you guys hear that?
Yeah.
Great. All right, so here we go. Thank you all for being here. I really, really appreciate it. I'm super excited to present the set of musical ideas that I have for you today. They're musical ideas that I think are really broad, like broadly applicable to many, many different styles of music, many different musical situations, many approaches. And they're also tools that I use really heavily in my own musical practice, in terms of analysis, in terms of composition, and in terms of improvisation. So I'm excited to talk to you about this musical topic that really matters to me a lot, that I really use a lot. And the topic is contrast. And contrast is a really broad topic, but we're going to talk about a specific approach to contrast in music and how you might be able to use this approach, use this mindset to enhance your creative practice, basically. So we're going to talk about contrast as a tool for analyzing music. We're going to talk about contrast as a tool for composition. And again, it's my kind of personal cure for writer's block, which I'll get into a little bit. And then we're going to talk about contrast as a tool for practicing improvisation. And we have some really great improvisers here, a lot of really great composers here too. So I'm excited to share it with you all. And as a tool for practicing improvisation, it's really the most powerful tool in my toolbox for enhancing my own creativity on my instrument. So learning how to play in new ways and learning how to become a more flexible improviser, learning how to improvise in ways that I can't currently do. I implement this practice and then I can do them later. So the way that I want to frame this idea of contrast is going to start with a kind of philosophical basis. And the way that I'm going to think about it is yin and yang. So I'm sure you've all seen this symbol before. It's kind of made its way into like popular American culture, despite being originally a Chinese philosophical concept. But the basic idea is that you have two opposites, so yin and yang, or which I actually don't know which the light one is yin and the dark one is yang, or the dark one is yin. I actually don't know that, but doesn't matter for our purposes. You have two opposites, which are seemingly totally unrelated, right? Because they're opposite from each other, but they're actually very, very deeply interconnected. They're permanently intertwined, and they give each other their meaning. So, for example, there is no loud without soft, right? Soft is what makes loud possible. And this is part of what is meant by the actual image of the symbol, is that each contains its opposite counterpart, so the dark swirl has the light circle in it, the light swirl has the dark circle in it, and that's the meaning of that, of that symbol. That's why they look like that. Like I said, loud and soft, they're two poles, kind of, there's a pole between them, they interact, and in this way, loud and soft are much more closely interconnected than something like loud and hot or loud and fast, things that you would seem like, oh, okay, these are, maybe similar or something like that. They're really not, they don't have this same sort of pull between them. So the idea is to apply this sort of thinking to music. So we can take musical elements and analyze them through a yin and yang contrast kind of philosophy, or contrast sort of light. So one good starting point that we've already talked about is volume. We have soft and we have loud. And one way that we can analyze any given piece of music is we say, well, in this particular musical moment that I'm in, where are we on the spectrum from softest possible option to loudest possible option, and that can tell us something about, you know, the current musical moment that we're in. How loud or soft is this relative to all possibilities, right? And then interestingly, there are two little side notes here that are already pretty cool. There's sort of a general range that most music stays in when we think about any of these yin yang contrast sort of polar, you know, relationships, or like when we have any spectrum between like loud on one side, soft on the other side. Most music fits in some kind of range, and then music that fits outside of that range is often the realm of conceptual art, which is really interesting. So like great example would be like John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds, a completely silent piece. It falls outside of this sort of normal range, and that makes it, you know, makes it a really controversial piece, makes it a conceptual piece, makes it something that like ruffled a lot of feathers, you know, at its time. And I would argue that like, okay, if I wrote a piece that was like so loud that anyone who heard it instantly went deaf, that would also be like a conceptual art piece on the other side, you know, like would be very controversial, very intense, whatever, blah, blah, blah. So another example of that could be like duration. You know, it's like most songs, they're going to fit somewhere between 1 to 2 minutes on the lower end, maybe like 10 to 15 minutes for a single song on the longer end. In like a symphonic setting, maybe that's like, you know, 4 minutes for your little orchestra piece, and maybe your symphony is max like 2 hours, but it doesn't usually fall outside of that range. But if I wrote a symphony that lasts 10 milliseconds, that would be a conceptual art piece. If I wrote a symphony that lasts 10 times longer than the entire lifespan of the universe, that would be a conceptual art piece, because it falls outside of this this sort of normal range, right? So you can already get some like really wacky sort of creative conceptual ideas by just thinking about elements of music that they have this normal range and then pushing outside of them. Another kind of interesting thing that I won't go too deeply into is that the normal range, like what does normal mean, or how do we sort of agree on what that is? It's largely defined by our physical experience that we have like in our bodies and our sort of like our actual bodily experiences. You know, something sounds low because it's low relative to our actual abilities to hear sound, or something sounds high because our ears have a certain range that we're physically able to hear sound, and it sounds high relative to that, you know. Another like conceptual thing, you know, if I wanted to write a piece that was lower than the human hearing range, you know, that nobody could hear because it's too low, that would be a conceptual art piece, you know. Same thing with like too high. So pushing outside of that range often means pushing outside of the regular experiences that people have with their bodies, you know. And this is something that that Vijay Iyer talks a lot about this. So if you're more interested in like how does the body relate to musical experience, you could check out some of his work, which is really incredible. So some of his like writing and his lectures, he talks about this a lot. His music is also great, but yeah, okay. So this is sort of the first step, is thinking about elements of music which we can pair in this way. There's, you know, the yin aspect, the yang aspect. They're polar opposites. You can think about musical moments on a spectrum between them. The next aspect that we're going to add is going to be the aspect of time. So there's this little anecdote, you know, this little I guess it's not a little anecdote. It was really influential, really important to me during my time at undergrad. This was a super formative musical experience when Krzysztof Penderecki came to Indiana University to perform St. Luke's Passion, which is his like giant orchestral piece. And I took a lot out of it, even though at the time I didn't really love the piece. I didn't actually like enjoy the experience that much. It was one of the most important like aha moments for me as a composer, thinking about why I didn't really love it very much. So my experience with the piece was hearing each adjacent musical moment as being the most contrasting thing you could possibly do at that moment. So he would start out something super consonant, like really clear metrically, whatever, really one thing. And then the next musical moment was totally the opposite, super dissonant, super loud, or super quiet, or it only goes down to one instrument playing long notes, and then everyone's playing as fast as they can, short notes, loud, whatever. So just these spikes of contrast that were super intense. And at the beginning of the piece, which is like, I think like pushing 2 hours long or something like that, it's a huge piece. I experienced it as basically like these really shocking things. I think I experienced it the way that I wanted it to be, sort of, or that it was maybe intended, was that like each of these moments so crazy and really grabbed my attention and really made me, feel something. But as the piece went on, I sort of started to realize that, okay, but every 30 seconds or 30 seconds to 2 minutes ish, I can expect to hear the most contrasting thing possible from wherever we're currently at. So after a little while, even though it was going to be some experience of super high contrast, it actually wasn't a surprise anymore. And so contrast, which is usually associated with surprise, usually associated with like setting up, you have some kind of expectation, but then it changes. It stopped working because the contrast was always at 100%. It was always the most highly contrasting thing possible. And so then it actually became like this meta sort of version where it's like, well, now I know that it's always going to be the most contrasting thing possible. And like at the 45-minute to an hour mark of the piece, the most shocking thing I could have heard would have been a 20-minute section of the piece with very little contrast, So that really made me think, okay, contrast is not, the be all end all of like what this is supposed to be about. You have to consider contrast in the amount of contrast that you use, sometimes using a lot of contrast, sometimes using very little contrast. And it's also worth noting that super high contrast can be great. Super low contrast can also be very great, where, if you listen to Beethoven or something like that, a lot of orchestral music, clearly the point to a large extent is the contrast. You get these big sweeping climaxes, you get this sort of narrative story arc concept of how you move about phrases. But you can also listen to music like, I would say, James Brown, for example, not really about the contrast. Like, I don't think the point of the music is the contrast. When you're at the beginning of it and then you skip to somewhere in the middle, it's kind of basically doing the same thing. And the point of the rhythm comes way more from like, the point of the music comes way more from rhythm, from the interlocking parts. There's like social things to consider in terms of why that music sounds amazing. There's sound production things in terms of why that music sounds amazing. But I don't think, like it's relatively low contrast from one section to the next section compared to other like types of music. So both are great. This is to say that you as a composer, as an improviser, as a musician, get to think about, do I want a ton of contrast in my music, or do I want little contrast in my music? And what's the most authentic way to express, kind of my musical ideas or the things that I'm excited about in making my own music? Do I want it to be high contrast? Do I want it to be low contrast? Right now, a lot of my projects are super low contrast music. They're like it's like drum set, percussion, a bunch of horns. That's it. That's the whole ensemble. And people are playing like 2-bar loops for 15 minutes. And we try to see how you know, how deep can we get the rhythms to interlock and make improvisatory decisions through there, you know? So again, contrast is not necessarily a marker of musical quality. High contrast does not mean good music necessarily. So so here's what I would sort of what I came to after that Penderecki experience is that there's contrast, or this is sort of the way that I'll propose for us to think about it, is there's contrast with the current musical moment relative to all the possibilities, right? How loud are we at right now relative to from silence to the loudest thing ever, right? That's the first sort of level, is the current moment. Then there is contrast within a small section. So if the section starts, you know, let's say we have a 16 measure phrase, does it stay at one volume, or does it, you know, gradually crescendo once, or is it wildly fluctuating all the time throughout that 16 measure phrase, or does it follow some kind of, you know, pattern? Its contrast in sort of like a local sense is going to be the second one, you know? So first one, all possible options, one moment. Second one, options for contrast in a small section. And then the third one would be sections as they relate to each other, next to each other, you know? So let's say, sorry, let me just check my notes here. So like consistency of adjacent sections, for example, do they all treat contrast? You know, if I have 3 sections, do they all stay the same volume? Does one of them stay the same volume and then the next one wildly fluctuates? How do sections treat contrast, you know, sort of throughout their, you know, throughout their time, whatever, throughout time differently? Maybe some sections stay the same, maybe some fluctuate. So at this point, this is actually a great little pause point, because I'm about to run out of my 40 free minutes on the Zoom call. So what I'm going to have you do, I'm going to end the call. I'm going to run to the bathroom for 1 minute, and then I'm going to re-record. We'll all pop back into the call in exactly 1 minute. And then we're going to start a group exercise. So I'll also, on the email that I sent you for this link, I'll send you a link for a Google Doc, and we'll all kind of move over to that Google Doc together. So we'll pause here, and I'll see you in a moment. All right, great. Now we're back on the recording. So I realized that it was going to be more annoying to hit reply all for this document. So I'm just going to paste it in the chat here, and we can all follow that link. So let me know if anyone has trouble finding this link here. Looks like we got it pretty well.
Oh yeah, we're in.
Awesome. I'll also just screen share for the sake of the recording, so that, you know, in the future people will know what we're looking at. So so now we're going to make this exercise, or do this exercise, which is working for a little while on making an encyclopedia of contrast. So we're going to just try to think about as many elements that we can in this yin yang setting, in this, you know, there's loud on one side, there's soft on the other side. And the way that we're going to organize it is basically going to be like this. So there's a category that we'll have, for example, the category might be melody, or harmony or rhythm or whatever. We can kind of mess around with the categories as we go. And there's going to be a parameter. So like, for example, the parameter might be the range of the melody, you know, in the abstract. So the total yin yang relationship is range of melody. On one side, you have the narrowest possible range of melody, and on the other side, you have the widest possible range of melody. Then we're going to put in sort of how these things might change over time, you know? So the amount of, you know, yin and yang stays the same over time, or the amount of yin and yang changes drastically over time. And this is sort of how we'll nest the parameters that we think of. You know, there's the category, the parameter, how much yin and yang, how they fit on a spectrum, and then how they might change over time. So I'll take you through the ones that I've done so far, and then we can sort of everybody can just chime in when they think of one. So range of melody, I have the narrowest possible range on one side. Melody is only one pitch, or melody covers the entire audible range of sound. And then this one, which is how it might change over time, is it consistently uses the same range, or some sections use a very narrow range, some sections use a wide range. Then like general range, so it's like, oh, it uses mostly low notes or uses very high notes. And then it might be the range changes, the general range that it uses changes over time, like that. Density of melody is one that I thought of. So melody has very few notes, is very sparse, or the melody is packed with as many notes as possible. And the density could be very uniform. So like if it starts sparse, it ends sparse, or the density could be, could change dramatically throughout a section. And this is sort of more on that. Then I have harmonic rhythm under harmony. I have one about pulse. I have one about tempo. Like tempo changes or consistency of tempo is one. I have a couple about form, like how many sections are there? How long are sections? If like, are they consistently long each section, or things like that? I have a couple for timbre. I have one for orchestration. I have one for improvisation. And also we could talk about, there are probably better ways to get categories, or to think about breaking up the categories. But this is sort of a starting point, and the point is not to be exhaustive. We'll get to this in a minute, but the point is, when I look at these things right now, as I'm looking at these things, I get excited about thinking about how I might compose specifically using contrast between these things. So when I think about like, density of melody as a parameter, immediately my head starts to spin in terms of like, there are so many options where if I wrote a piece that has, 8 sections in this piece, and I really try to show high contrast between, density of melody, or I pick a few of these sort of yin yang contrast elements and I pair them up, it starts to become very, very easy for me, very exciting for me, how I might compose using these things. So I'm going to turn it over now to anybody who thinks of any of them, and just sort of, we'll just start by kind of yelling it out, I guess. And we might do the chat.
Yeah, dude, I have one. From like more of something that you could probably only do like in a software, but something that is used a lot in like electronic music production, at least, is your overall like stereo width, and where like you're placing sounds.
Great.
In terms of that, like especially in a genre like that, that's more focused on, really focused on the contrast, in the point of there's like, like the drop or whatever, or there's like a build. It's very common to take basically like the bus channel of like everything but your drums, that's probably gonna be like a side chain or something.
Yeah.
As you're trying to like build the tension and kind of wind things up, kind of gently squish the top and the bottom too of your EQ, and you're just kind of cutting off like that, instead of having like your very, very top shelf be like 18K, you might kind of start to bring it down and approach like 16, and you're kind of gonna lose your sub as you go. And then a lot of people in Ableton, they'll do a little like utility on the master, and just kind of bring the width down to maybe, I don't know, 25% less than what it would be. And then when it have this explosion of like, wow, the sound is so wide and so huge all of a sudden.
Totally.
Especially when your final master is so squashed, it's like you kind of have to make that like false contrast almost when you're, you have that super hot final mix down kind of thing. So
perfect. Man, this is why I was glad that you were coming to this, is to bring some electronic perspectives that I was like, I would never have come up with stereo with, but that's a great one to put. So I put it under timbre, if everyone sees where I'm at right now. So stereo width, and we're going to kind of do it those three ways. So relative to all the possibilities, which is the narrowest possible stereo width. I don't really know exactly what that would like entail, but I just put the narrowest possible and the widest possible. And then the sort of next level would be, how does it change within a section? So one version would be full section uses like treats stereo width identically. And then on the other side of that spectrum would be within the section stereo width changes dramatically and maybe often could be, or something like that, you know. So tons of stereo width change and no stereo width change within a local section. And then the third one, which is relative to sections within the song, could be each section treats stereo width change the same, you know. So like you're always doing that sort of narrowing and widening thing, you know, widening thing, or it's always exactly the same or whatever, you know. Like if there's like 5 sections of your piece, like letter A, B, C, D, E, and these you know, each last about a minute or something like that, if the behavior is basically the same in letters A, B, C, D, and E, that would be one. Or the other one would be each section treats stereo width changes differently. You know, so some of them do this severely narrowing and widening thing. Some of them, it's staying at the same level for the entire section. Some of them might have very dramatic changes. Some might have no changes, you know. So these are sort of the three levels that I talked about. The current moment relative to all possibilities. Within a section, how do we treat it? Between multiple sections, how do we treat it? That's a great one. Let's get another one. Yeah, Jacob.
I was gonna say, well, what about predetermined, like everything's written out versus non-deterministic elements?
Yeah, I put that one kind of,
Oh, you
put
do?
amount
Oh,
of amount of improvisation, but there are like many many different ways that we could sort of think about this. So I put no improvisation, which is actually kind of like a conceptual parameter in a certain way. Like even I think when like, you know, people are reading sheet music, they're still like kind of improvising like their sound quality and dynamic decisions and stuff like that. So like zero improvisation, you almost have to use a computer. And then 100% improvisation on the other side of that spectrum, you know, could be yeah. So is that sort of what you're talking about? Or are you thinking
Yeah,
about
I forgot you. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll get cool.
Another thing that's like really close to that, like when you're talking about like a computer and stuff, would just be like randomness, like from a computer. Like if you were to draw in a art pattern or you were to play in a melody or something, or people will use randomness, whatever, to determine like a pitch variance to make things sound more human, or like when they're making their drums, they'll do like a randomness. Overall, like, you know, loudness or whatever on like a cymbal hit or something like that to kind of make it sound more human. So just a certain element of like a computer generated randomness.
Yeah, I'll add that one for sure. And sort of the miscellaneous. I have a feeling that there are many many like of these that are specific to computer music that I'm like very excited that like I'm excited to sort of like bring this approach. And this is a lot of like what I think about in like Max MSP stuff too, is sort of like having a computer you know, determine where we're going to be at on that. So yeah, I'll leave that one there in sort of the miscellaneous, but that might deserve its own like category at some point. But that's a great one. Let's get like 2 or 3 more maybe.
Like
I'll jump off of Gabe's, or sorry,
Yeah.
I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah, you got it.
No.
And I think this maybe fits best in melody, although I could see it fit in a few categories, and it's specific to the composition process.
Yeah.
But rather than thinking of just range, there's also range, like as in from this side, it would be that it's a little tidbit that repeats over and over again, whereas the other side is that nothing repeats. So you have hundreds of bars where
Yeah. Like maybe like thematic material, sort of like relative reuse or economy or something like that.
Yes, and you have just like, yeah, the maximum level is just it goes on and there's
Yeah.
almost no thematic repetition, whereas at its other side, it's just like the same thing repeating over and over again.
That's an awesome one. So yeah,
Really
reuse
cool.
of theme is in, I put it under melody here, or development or something like that.
That's something that like that's super specific to like a genre, I feel like, like a lot of, more poppy stuff is going to reuse like the hook or whatever, because that's kind of the point of it, is to be that like earworm thing. But
Yeah.
even jump off that again too, it's like just like the genre as a whole too. Like I feel like there's a lot of music now that I listen to that will go really heavily back and forth between alternative and electronic, or even like dubstep mixed with like jazz a lot. And it sounds kind of crazy, but like there's a lot of people now that are kind of making it into not even necessarily a smoother transition, but it'll hit and that switch will flip and it just works. You know what I mean? Like there are pieces that go from really heavy synth use into like almost all organic instruments, and like we'll get into like a swung like jazz improv section, and then we'll end back with a more structured electronic thing again. And there's kind of this little bit of like a dance in between like the genres themselves, even like within like a single piece. It's kind of hard to fit it into one single slot like that.
Yeah, even one could be sort of like consistency within a genre, could be like, like how like one kind of miscellaneous or like really broad topic or broad spectrum could be like, one pole of a spectrum is this completely fits exactly within this genre, this style, this established cultural conception of what this type of music sounds like. It totally checks all the boxes. And then another thing could be, or the other side of that spectrum could be like, this does not fit into any kind of box. So these parameters, this is worth saying, that these parameters can be very concrete, like very, mathematical physics of sound type parameters. They can be, things like that, or they can be very very abstract. And the reason that I'm happy to put them both in the same kind of sheet is sort of what we're going to so we're going to move on from this sort of exercise now, and we all have this sheet. So if we feel like, throwing stuff in later or whatever, just for the sake of time, I'm going to keep moving on. But if we feel like throwing more stuff in later, this is like a really fun exercise to get you thinking about, what sort of things do I want to compose with? And yeah, the reason that I'm excited to put both of those types of things in.
Can we just dump it in the chat? Is that okay?
What's that?
Can we just dump some of our thoughts in the chat?
Yeah, big time. Or just put them in the doc if you want. Either one would be totally good.
Thank you.
So yeah, all good. Yeah. So the reason that I'm happy to put both of these kinds of things in is because my main reason to use this is for compositional inspiration, basically. So I would say that we can, well, let me step back a little bit. So we can think about what we're doing in a certain way. It's actually great that we sort of segued into the genre conversation, because part of what we can think about what we're doing as is saying certain genres of music are going to very consistently fit within certain ranges of what we're talking about. Access to the doc. Let's see. Let's put them in the chat for now, so I don't have to figure out. I'll figure out how to allow people to edit the doc in a little bit here. just to keep things moving along. Thank you for that, Chris. So you could argue that what we're doing is building a set of tools that we can use to describe genre with. So like if we talk about, let's say, straight ahead jazz, for example, as a genre, there's a certain type of harmonic approach where you don't really fall too far outside of this certain approach to harmony. There's this approach to rhythm where you don't really fall too far outside. You don't usually have songs that are shorter than 3 minutes or longer than 10 minutes, or there's orchestration considerations, which instruments are playing. There are timbral considerations, there are melodic considerations, where basically if you fall within all of these little windows on our yin yang contrast spectra, that's what creates someone's perception of a genre. So if you're playing straight ahead, but all of a sudden you're using 12-note harmonies and your songs are 40 minutes long, and they don't feature a melody solos melody form, and there's now either way more improvisation or way less improvisation than there usually is, then we've sort of departed from what people consider to be straight ahead jazz. So this, which is not a value judgment, it's just like, this is sort of how people are making genre in their head. They say it falls in this window of this set of contrasting elements, and this window in this other set. And if you put a bunch of those together, which is what people do intuitively, then you can sort of figure out, okay, this is what the genre means. It means these harmonic things, these rhythmic things, these sound things. So we could, I can argue that we can also sort of reverse engineer this analytical approach. So, for example, we can identify, narrow windows of yin yang spectra of contrast, and then actually compose our own genres using this idea. So, for example, if I could make a new genre of music by saying, okay, we're only allowed to use the viola. This is a genre where it's only using the viola. It only uses the C string on the viola. It only allows glissandi between any two pitches. It only allows dynamics above forte, and it incorporates a middle section that involves hand clapping. And if I put those things together, those constraints on poles from yin to yang, if I say it has to be within this certain window for several different parameters of music, several different aspects of music, then I would say this is a new genre. If I wrote 100 pieces of music and then other people started writing 100 pieces of music which always adhere to these rules that I've sort of outlined, then it might not be the best genre of music in the world. You might not like this genre of music particularly or whatever, but I would argue that this would be a style or a genre of music, So this is sort of a way that you can either break out of stylistic constraints, or you can, expand, or you can subvert people's expectations about like, oh, well, this is a modern jazz musician, but but he does this thing that's outside of that normal zone, and that's exciting and can make your music feel very fresh to people. So this has sort of been, like I mentioned earlier, my inexhaustible cure for writer's block. Whenever I get stuck, whenever I'm like, oh, I'm feeling uninspired, uncreative, what I do is I go to my actual list, my physical list of these elements of contrast that I've made, similar to the one that, I sort of took some of them and put them in that doc. And I just look at that list and immediately become inspired. And a lot of my compositions, which maybe I'll send these compositions along after the class is over, just for the sake of time, are built off of that. I recently wrote one for jazz quintet where the piano just features an 8-bar loop. It's like there's no contrast. The whole 5-minute thing, the piano just does the exact same thing. And then the horns, I decided to, out of the quintet, there's trumpet and tenor. I decided to highly emphasize contrast between staccato moments and legato moments and try to show the mixing between those two approaches. And then just with those sort of two things, immediately it was like, okay, and now I'm off to the writing process. I'm feeling super creative. I feel like I've never written this thing. I'm not just repeating my ideas and, rehashing old stuff that I've already written. It felt, it felt fresh just to take sort of these two spectra and say, okay, one, I want low contrast. One, I want to show high contrast between staccato and legato. And now all of a sudden I feel like I'm doing something fresh again. And compositionally, it can also manifest itself in more formal ways. So, for example, like my string quartet that I wrote recently, which I'll send maybe the score to everybody on the email chain. My string quartet was just me trying to go, let me try to explore every all the nooks and crannies of no vibrato at all on one side and like the most possible vibrato, beyond vibrato, like glissing up and down the string, crazy amounts of vibrato. And that was the one sort of guiding factor that drove all of my compositional decision making in that setting. So it gives me a lot of inspiration like that. And what I want to do, I'll bring everyone back to the doc for sort of exercise 2, or for just this little sort of like table that I have, which is just an example of basically, excuse me, here is a compositional sketch. I was originally thinking about doing this as a group exercise, but I think I'm going to save it for now for time. But I encourage you to do something like this. If not to make your own piece, then just as like an actual exercise. So here's an example of like a sketch that I might make that sort of uses this yin yang contrast as its basis for a number of different parameters. So one parameter I decided to use was duration of the section. I have some sections that are short, sort of medium, and one long section. I have a general level of rhythmic activity that I want to use. Here's a lot, here's a little, and then I can play with those as it goes. I have a general harmonic approach, so parameters in terms of harmony. Here's what I might use. I might do, whatever. And then here's my general dynamic approach for each section. And this is not something that I would necessarily, after I started writing, very strictly adhere to, but it's also very good to just be like, I'm giving myself something that allows me to sort of break away from my intuition, which might lead me down sort of a stale path. For me, it's like, at least I know that if I build one of these things and then write something in it, I'm going to come up with something that feels new to me, feels like I haven't written it before, feels like it's, feels like it's fresh for my sort of tastes, So another way that you could put this would be, when I do something like this, when I impose these sort of constraints or these sort of goals for each section on myself, it ends up feeling way more creative. Counterintuitively, ends up feeling way more creative than when I just try to write whatever I'm thinking or feeling, or just write totally intuitively. And I'm definitely not the only composer who's sort of on this thing. Like Stravinsky was a really famous proponent of this approach, Igor Stravinsky. So like, he was a big believer in this sort of limitations breed creativity concept. And so I want to talk about the next sort of thing the next thing I want to talk about is intuition as a musical, as a aspect that influences our musical practice, let's say, because I think it is very double-edged. It's, on the one hand, the thing that allows us to make music from the heart, like from, something that is true to ourselves and allows us to make it in real time. Using our intuition is what allows us to do that. But if you don't shake it up a little bit, or if you only rely on intuition, you can have a hard time finding anything new to do, because intuition might just kind of, if every time I call on my intuition, I feel like, oh, it's just taking me down the same path that it always takes me down, then it's not really serving its purpose to enhance my creativity or enhance my creative practice. And there's some like decent kind of science that goes into like this idea of, repeating things. By repeating things many times, you sort of ingrain them. And, there's sort of an abstract, I won't dive into that too much either, because I feel like I'll run out of time again on that. But if you find yourself making music and going, ugh, I'm playing the same thing all the time, or I'm writing the same thing all the time, and I can't, break out of it, this is the approach that I recommend, is going to this analytical approach first, giving yourself some rules to work within, and then that will allow you to have a new, fresh kind of starting point. And then you draw on your intuition to make sure that what you're making is authentic, and make sure that, what you're making is true to yourself and intuitive, and calling on your intuition generally will be a good way to connect with people and things like that, things that we usually want to do with our music. So, I heard this great phrase recently in a totally different context, in a like clinical psychology context, which was the phrase "think, feel, act." Have you guys ever heard this phrase before? Yeah. Really interesting. And it's, I don't really know like the what this means in its original context, but it was really inspiring to hear that phrase, because it's like, this is exactly how I want to carry out my musical practice, by doing just a little bit of analytical work up front. Then I can feel, and then I can use my intuition, which is something that's very important to me in music. And then, act, and then I actually carry it out. I do it, I make the music. And this, this has been sort of the flow that works really well for me in my compositions. My feelings, if I just go straight to the feel and then act, it might lead me down kind of the same path. But when I think about it first, force myself to go down a new path, and then feel, it feels like an adventure every time. So in a sense, this sort of examining yin yang spectra of contrast is a slightly more methodical way of doing what Stravinsky is kind of talking about, which is imposing these limitations on ourselves. And it's like, if we look at that table, it's like, instead of writing whatever I want to do for section 2, I kind of have a set, thing. And by working within these constraints, it's going to free up my kind of creativity. Another way to look at it could be by analyzing these yin yang spectra of contrast. We gain a deeper understanding of musical possibilities, and therefore are able to make musical choices with deeper intentionality. So if you only ever use your intuition, you don't examine what you're doing, you could be accused, especially this is big in like contemporary classical composition, circles. They really want you to be like, I wrote this for this reason. This is why I wrote this. And so knowing your full field of options is only going to serve to enhance your creative life, really thinking about what is the total way that I could treat something like volume is going to make you a more thoughtful thoughtful musician, composer. So far we've talked about how to use these spectra as a tool for analyzing music, the sort of encyclopedia of contrast exercise. And we've talked about how you might be able to incorporate these into your compositional practice, which is either in a sort of broad inspirational way or in a very intentional, this is the map of the piece way. I'm using a lot of these really heavily sort of way. And now I want to talk about how you can use sort of the same idea to practice improvising music. So improvisation, I think, it's very uniquely influenced by muscle memory and intuition because it happens in real time, so you really need to draw on muscle memory more than you need to draw on muscle memory to compose, because you have that real time constraint on yourself while you're doing it. And I would also argue that all the musical decisions that you're making are a product of your current muscle memory as much as they're a product of your artistic, decision making, or what you want to express. It has a lot to do with what you've physically practiced so far in your life. The improvisational choices you make on any given instrument. And as I've mentioned before, relying only on intuition can kind of lead you down the same path, So like, for example, if I were to ask a piano player, okay, just improvise for me for 20 minutes or something like that, they might, kind of get stuck, or maybe they would play something that's totally new that they've never played before, but they might kind of end up just spitting out some stuff that they've worked on and that sort of thing before. But if I ask them, okay, improvise for 20 minutes, and every 5 minutes you're going to change your meter, and for the first 5 minutes you're only allowed to use the 2 lowest octaves of the piano, and you're only allowed to use fortissimo long notes, and blah blah blah, and I put all these constraints on them, then when I ask them to improvise, it's very likely that they'll improvise something that they have not improvised before. So here's something that I wrote sort of recently about this sort of concept that I'll just sort of read to you verbatim. So create arbitrary rules for an improvisation that force you to break away from muscle memory pathways that you are prone to falling into when using your intuition alone. This allows you to practice improvisation, the essential skill of making decisions in the moment, using your emotions, using your intuition, but without getting stuck in cognitive ruts, muscle memory ruts, which become harder to escape the more deeply they're executed. Through this type of practice, you invariably stumble on new material, new muscle memory pathways that you find beautiful, that you would never have discovered without implementing rules that force you to explore. So for example, this piano example, if I give you these rules and then say improvise, you are more likely to stumble on things, and then you're building new sounds, new experiences, new sort of muscle memory things. So we can use these yin yang spectra to help us gain inspiration for how to find our limitations. If we go back to the Google Doc, for example, let me go back here. If we go back to our sort of first section, it's like, okay, improvise, but I'm going to make some decision for how I want to improvise using the range of the melody. Or I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to practice improvising, but it's going to be a 10-minute long improvisation, and I'm going to move from the busiest possible, most possible notes in my improvisation that I can, and then by the end of it, I'll be using the fewest possible notes that I can in my improvisation. Or harmonic rhythm, I'm going to improvise, and it's going to start out with, each chord lasts a super long time, and then, they're going to gradually get faster throughout. these sort of constraints can serve as inspiration for how we want to practice improvising, how we force ourselves out of our sort of our habits, our habits for improvisation. So let me go back here for a second. So I'm also going to, draw your attention. We won't work on this for now, but this is another way to sort of talk about one of the things that that we have at the bottom of the document. It's a master list of parameters and limitations to enhance your creativity and depart from limiting muscle memory and improvisation. So here's sort of two contexts, because most of us are jazz musicians here, or have, some experience in that. So there's freely improvise and then use the following constraints as you sort of improvise in a free context, or improvise over a jazz tune, like in a context, but then you add these rules, for example. So I might say, okay, I'm just going to do a free improvisation, but I'm just going to really focus on, emphasizing dynamic contrast in my improvisation. Or I'm going to freely improvise, but I only get to use notes from the B flat major scale and then E major scale for the next minute, or whatever, then you could do it over a jazz tune. And we're actually about to run out of time. So I'm just going to ask everybody to rejoin one more time, really quick, and then we'll sort of wrap it up. We probably have like 10, 15 minutes left tops or something like that. So I'll restart the meeting and we'll all pop back in here. All right. Sorry about that. One of these days, maybe I'll get the Zoom premium here.
Not worth it. This is so easy to do. Like,
Okay.
we just reopen it. Like, save the money. Who cares? Dude,
All
this
right,
is
fair.
awesome.
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
Oh man, you're good. No worries.
Cool.
Mm-hmm.
Eliana had to split, so I think this will be us. We might get one or two more people. Not you, Eliana, the other Eliana.
Unprecedented.
I know.
Never happened in my whole life.
I know. We should have had you like have some kind of Eliana competition while you were both here.
I'm gonna have a drink about that later.
So, okay. So where we left off was we left off over here. And I'm talking about so we can sort of impose these rules as we improvise. And I would encourage everyone to sort of take some time and try to contribute to this list, or to make your own list for each of these things. So if I was going to assign, like obviously optional homework, would be work on this list, the Encyclopedia of Contrast list, trying to fill it out and add as many parameters as you can, either for yourself or for this document, however it makes sense to you. I would say try creating a compositional sketch with this sort of yin yang approach to contrast in mind, and see if you have a good experience making something that looks like this, and see if it feels like oh, this is a more creative, or this has helped me in some way, or figure out a practice that might work for you as you compose, that's sort of based on this, and specifically based on thinking about contrast in certain areas and how it might change over the course of a piece. And then it would be to practice improvising, but with this sort of approach of using rules. So there are all sorts of things that we could put in this list, and maybe we'll take some time later or something to try to fill out this list and make it more full. But try practice improvising in a freely improvised context, and try practicing improvising over a jazz tune, but sort of with these rules, you know. One of the really cool experiences that I had at Indiana was when Marquise Hill came to play with one of the groups, this amazing trumpet player who's just a unbelievable improviser. And he played with the ensemble that I was in and taught this master class. And this is exactly what he taught. He was like, this is my whole practice concept is I pick a tune. The tune that we did in the context of that master class was Solar. And then we just made rules and rules and rules and rules. And we would try, okay, everybody's going to improvise for this chorus, but you always have to start your new melodic line from the third of the current chord, you know, and then we would work on that. Or, okay, you can only use eighth notes or like rests, you know, you have to use eighth notes. That's your rhythmic constraint. Or you can never use any steps. You always have to use intervals of a third or more. Or, you know, and then the list just went on, and we worked for like 2 hours on this. And then it was like, okay, now we've practiced for, you know, hours doing all these limitations. Now when we take all the limitations away, it's like you know, like the batter warming up with the extra heavy bat, you know, like we've worked so hard to get this sound in our ears, and it's like so much more difficult to improvise with these things that now when we take it away, you feel totally uninhibited, and you feel like you have, you know, all of this you know, new approaches basically to it. You know, now I've practiced playing over this tune, you know, never using half steps or whole steps. And so now it might just intuitively occur to me to approach that for one of these choruses now, you know, like I might not be intellectually thinking about the you know, the intervallic content, but because I've spent a bunch of time practicing it, it just sort of pops up in my improvisation in a way that feels fresh, that you can surprise yourself with. And it's still doing this, like I'm playing from the heart. It's just that now I have this new muscle memory to draw from, you know, now I have this new thing that I've practiced that it might just pop up even when I'm not thinking about it intellectually. So this is really my main approach for practicing the drums, is when I practice improvisation, it's this sort of thing. It's like, okay, I'm going to practice improvising, but my left hand always has to be on the snare drum, or I'm going to practice improvising, but no two limbs can ever play in rhythmic unison, or I'm going to practice improvising, but it has to be at this dynamic and this meter, and we'll see what happens. And it really is what you know, allows me to feel when I spend a lot of time practicing in this way, it's what allows me to feel comfortable in a very wide variety of musical settings and gain like new kinds of facility on my instrument while still developing this skill of like playing what you hear, using your ears, using your intuition, following your you know, your intuitive melodic sense. That's a skill that also has to be worked on and developed. And so the cool thing about these exercises is that it's basically that skill. It's practicing the fundamental skill of improvisation, but you are also doing it in a new context, basically. So you're giving yourself a new world to improvise within. So I just want to sort of like recap, do like a really quick, you know, here's all the things that we covered, top to bottom, and then maybe we'll talk for a minute about you know, some questions and stuff like that, but then I'll let everybody go because I know we've been here for quite some time. So to recap, contrast is a super powerful tool in music, but it's not the only tool. Lots of, you know, great music uses very little to no contrast. So contrast is just one of many tools. But whether we want to use a lot of contrast or a little contrast, it can be really great to be very intentional about it, to make decisions about how much contrast you want to make to best bring your musical ideas to life. we're trying to use the right amount of contrast. We can think about contrast in terms of yin and yang, of two poles that are interrelated, that have a sort of pull on each other. There's loud over here, soft over here, and we move between them. And we can also think about contrast as it relates to time in three ways. We can think about it, our current musical moment relative to all the possibilities of sound. How loud are we relative from silence to the loudest thing? We can think about it within a small section of music. So how does this aspect of music that we're analyzing change sort of locally? How does it behave in this small section? Or we can think about it across many sections. So like, does each broad chunk of this piece, if you can even think about this piece in terms of like, a bunch of chunks, strung together, how does this certain element behave with regards to contrast in each of the sections? So those are sort of the three ways that I would propose to think about it. I would say that genre or style can kind of be thought of as a consistent adherence to a certain window in contrasting elements. If this sort of music, like, is it metal music anymore if it's like barely audible? Like, I don't know, maybe falling out of like a certain window kind of breaks you of being in that genre. And we can create our own genres by just choosing a bunch of ranges of here's the total possibilities. We narrow it to this certain range. If we do that for a bunch of different aspects of music, we can kind of create our own style of music in a very like intellectual, very intentional way. And then you can integrate this into your compositional approach. So for me, intuition is a double-edged sword because it allows for authenticity. It allows for me to play from the heart, but it can also box me in by, forcing me down stale muscle memory pathways, making me feel like I'm improvising, but really I'm just kind of playing the same stuff that I always play. Because if I always draw on my intuition in the same way, it tends to want to spit out the same kind of material. So this has been a way to sort of help me get the best out of intuition by shaking it up. This idea of think, feel, act, doing a little bit of analytical thinking to get me out of my habits. Then I rely on my intuition, my feelings. And as I make music, I find myself going down paths that I wouldn't have thought of before. So we sort of get the best of both worlds, the intuitive and emotional side in a new context that we analytically arrived at. And finally, you can use this as inspiration in your compositions, sort of generally, or you can use it very specifically as inspiration in your compositions, or you can sort of use it as a tool for, musical analysis or for improvisational inspiration as you sort of think about contrasting elements, think about, I want to practice improvising within this narrow range, then I practice improvising and I build new muscle memory. So again, thank you all so much for coming to this. I really, really appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed and got something out of it. I'll just take like a couple, if you guys have any questions or comments or something like that, we can maybe do that for like a few minutes. And then we'll call it. Yeah, Eliana.
So I definitely missed a lot of the beginning, and
Yeah, that's okay.
But these sort of, I'm interested to see what the beginning is and how this is presented, because seeing the end, it's really hard for me to approach these kind of like theoretical conversations about like, what is genre, what is music, what is timbre, how do we talk about these things like very theoretically, because I'm like a classical baby and am interested in jazz in the way that like form is also, there's still like pillars of form and concepts that like I can relate to from classical. And so this was really interesting to think about, like, I cannot just think about form and the different sides of form or just melody, because when we talk about form or we talk about variation and melody, those things are really connected for me. So like my concept of form, I'm thinking about how does it deviate from what that genre typically holds? Like how is an early Beethoven sonata, how does it compare to a late Beethoven sonata in terms of form and sections? And even if the sonata form is the same, the way that the melody and the like cadence is, it's just that, I don't know, comparison to what I know is really interesting. And then as we talk about exercises, this is very like scaffolding for your own compositional practices. And then the exercises at the bottom are like, this is distinctly scaffolding for students or for a group. And I've been thinking a lot about my human experience as a boundary of what I can create.
Sure. Yeah. We talked about that a little bit actually when you weren't here, which is funny about like a lot of these spectra, the really extreme sides, you know, or sort of the what defines like the normal range in one of these things has a lot to do with just like what our bodies are, you know. So like something sounds low, not because it's like objectively low, but because it's low relative to how high or low our bodies can hear, you know. So there's definitely like, you know, as we think about these things, that's a pretty good approach. And as I mentioned to these guys, Vijay Iyer talks a lot about that and writes a lot about that in like lectures about how like this experience of making music is really inextricably tied to your experience of like having a body, you know, and a lot of the way that we perceive music is very closely related to that, or you can see really close parallels, you know, like people tend to like tempos between 40 beats per minute and 200, and our heart can only beat at 40 or 200 or else we'll die. And if you hear music outside of that range, it tends to be a little more conceptual. If you hear music way outside of that range, it tends to have less of that sort of intuitive, like, you know, land, although that's not always the case for sure. And then the other thing that I would say is that it is definitely like, you know, this, I like the word of scaffolding because it sort of does describe what I'm trying to like get across here, which is these are broad structural considerations, and separating them out is not always you know, the most like we can't really get a picture of what music is just by doing this, you know. So like the idea of, oh, I want to exhaustively make my, you know, my concept of contrast and I'll cover every musical element or something like that, that's not really the goal necessarily. The goal is just to say, if I take some time, think analytically about this, you know, I can use it then as a point for creative inspiration, and I can try to jump off of, you know, off of what I came up with. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. This is first of all, such a delicious document. And then also this conversation is just really delightful. It's always like really nice to be like talking about the zone of proximal development with like not education students, and like everyone can appreciate that concept. So it's really cool to see it.
Awesome. I do not know what the zone of proximal development is. What is that?
It's like scaffolding. It's like right beyond what your current ability is, but not so far off that you get discouraged by like the
sure. Yeah. The next, that's really, yeah.
It's like 5-note scale to La 6.
Right. Totally. Cool. Does anyone else have any maybe like one more question, comment, concern? Yeah, Phil.
How do I say this? I guess I don't know. I don't want to like make a comment and be like, "This is what I think about all your stuff that you said." It was a wonderful job, by the way. You like this was slamming. Yeah. Excellent talking, man.
Thanks.
So the whole talk, I love this scaffolding thing. I like this incremental development of things because it's like when you, and then this idea of limitations being put on your work increases your like foundational knowledge of how the system itself is assembled, which is really freaking cool. Like when you realize that your C major scale actually has an A flat in it, what the hell? Like that's the coolest thing of all time. You get every other possible tonality that you're living in. So I don't know. So and I don't know. This is why I should maybe get my doctorate at some point, because I've been thinking about these in terms of musical derivatives.
Mm-hmm.
Musical derivatives. So in the same way that like speed yields acceleration and acceleration yields velocity, right? Your C major chord yields a G7 and your G7 chord yields an E flat harmonic major, like it's all sorts of things built on this system, and all and what you've been talking about is a really great way to kind of pick what you want to do inside there. Like, what are you interested in? Like, what do I need to develop to make myself a better communicator, so I can better incorporate myself into this thing that's not going to stop because we're on stage. That's just sort of where I've been, where you took me today, and I feel like I've grown as a person. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah.
I almost kind of want to like add and like agree with you, Phil, like so much. Like I was kind of thinking about it in that context, but also kind of in this other context that I think about, composition and just kind of like musicality as a whole. And that's this relationship between like emulation and like imitation, and how those two things are tools that can kind of help you grow and like find your own space to play and like your own sound. And I think regardless of if you're talking about jazz improv, when you're, maybe writing down and trying to, take a solo that someone played and, write it all out and understand the, choices that, like improviser made, it's very similar to like creating a sound on a synthesizer or something like that too, where, you're going to take an artist and be like, oh, like AU5 made this huge synth bass in this way. And it's extra interesting when there's a YouTube version of it and you can see exactly how he built that out in like Serum or something. And then that space for your own like originality to like build on that comes from your ability to kind of take all those pieces and all those influences and then be like, okay, I like this, but I'm going to use a different filter on this bass, just in the same way that, okay, maybe you transcribed a jazz solo and you muscle memory out a little chunk of it, but you're going to modify it based on something else. But yeah, I mean, just like thinking about all those things. And then also, when I'm going to go practice this, either in terms of improv or in terms of like sound design or, composition or whatever, it's really interesting to think about the ways in which you can apply those limitations to kind of like free yourself from like a creative block, it's just like a really cool thing. So yeah, I also got a ton out of this, and thank you so much, Jake. It was awesome, dude.
Thank you guys. Really, really appreciate it. Oh, we have something from Chris, because you're in the cafe, so I'll read it out loud. So can't really talk because I'm in the cafe, but one thing I really struggle with is structure and contrast. So this class really helped. Thank you. Am I going to have any more? Maybe we should, if, maybe we'll think about setting one of these up. I mentioned this earlier, but this is just mostly to try to get like a video sample of my teaching for this thing that I'm applying for. But I really like the interest, and I really, I spend a ton of time thinking in this world. And so like getting everyone's outside perspectives and bringing these, like bringing this type of thinking and approach to analysis and approach to composition and improvisation to other people helps me a lot, because I have to think about how can I clearly present it to people? Like, how can I get these ideas that I use and actually like make sure that everyone understands what I'm talking about in like an incremental way. And then, they just like, everyone has different musical experiences. So like you know, hearing, oh yeah, this is how this could apply to synths, and this is how it could apply to Beethoven, and this is how, you know, all this stuff. You know, it's really useful to sort of expand this core set of ideas about how we can analyze, compose, and improvise with contrast kind of at the heart, and send it out in more directions than I have for my own, you know, musical life. So it's really great. Please apply to the position of teacher of this class. Thank you. Yeah, so anyway, this is great. Yeah, if we're all interested, you know, it'd be fun to like maybe try to do some more of these, or try to, you know, I'll think about that. And I have everyone's email, so you know, I'll hit everybody up. Anyone else, any final thoughts or anything like that? Cool. All right, well, for real, thank you all so much for coming. And yeah, I think I'm gonna maybe upload this whole thing. Oh wait, we have one final thought. Okay. Yeah, but I think I'm gonna maybe upload this to you know, to like YouTube or something like that, and cut it together so that you know, just do like one big long video. But yeah, otherwise, thank you guys so much. I think we're good here.
Sweet.
Really appreciate it. Any composers I recommend we listen to who do really well with contrast? I'll think about that too. I mean, I think this is a view that you can. One thing that I actually kind of forgot to mention. This will be the last thing. One thing that I forgot to mention is that you can think about take any two pieces of music that you like and hold them up next to each other. They can be the same genre, they can be different genres. And when you think about the way these two musicians who you like approach contrast differently, that can tell you, you know, that can tell you a lot about how to think about like making these spectra of yin and yang contrast relationships, how you can think about it that way. So like, for example, if I think about James Brown's The Big Payback, which I love, for The Payback, and John Coltrane's Interstellar Space, it's like, okay, there are things that are approached differently. Pulse and time are approached differently. Some instrumentation things are approached differently. Interestingly, some sound things are approached really similarly. The drum sound on both those recordings, super similar. Tuning, blah, 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 super similar. And so when I think about just the aspects that are the same and the aspects that are different, then you can kind of take those and extrapolate them into these spectra, these poles and stuff like that. So hopefully that helps. But I think you should start by applying this worldview, not to like people who already do it well, but to people who you already like, you know. That would be my thought. Yeah. All right. Amazing. Thank you guys so much.
Hey, thank you, dude.
And I will see you all soon. Appreciate it.
Thanks, dude.